All right. According to my watch, it is 20 after. And so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a minute, hasn't it? It seems like it's been a while, although time is pretty much meaningless in these days. But thank you for being here. Thank you. Hopefully, you're healthy, you're safe as well. Um, we will get through this. I'm sure of it. And someday we will see each other again in person. But until then, thank goodness we have these kind of arrangements so that we can share and continue to grow and be together, at least in some form. This presentation, if you can tell from the title, is We Wrote an API Description. Now what? And so, what I'm going to be covering in this is about how OpenAPI has become the way to capture API intent within organizations. And especially within API design for shops, you got to create an open API description. But after you create this machine parsable description, then what do you do with it? What's next? How do you get the greatest amount of return on your investment for the time and energy that you invested in it? And how are others using their open API artifacts beyond just documentation? How do you get started? I'll answer those questions and more in this talk. My name is Matthew Reinbold, and I am Postman's Director of API Ecosystems and Digital Transformation. At Postman, I'm a member of the Open Technologies Program. Our mission is to improve the practice, education, and research for companies of all shapes and sizes. In addition to that, I also write a weekly API email newsletter. The amount of API-related things published week in, week out, it can be overwhelming. NetAPI Notes started as my own attempt to filter the signal from the noise. It just turned out that also happened to be really valuable to a lot of other people. So I started publishing it. It also prepares me for conversations like the one that we're about to have today. First, though, we should probably establish a few things. I'm not going to cover the history of OpenAPI or AsyncAPI and how they became nearly de facto API specifications. There's plenty of other talks, some even at this conference, that go into much greater detail on that. I want to clarify how I will use a couple phrases throughout this presentation. If you use these words differently in your day-to-day work, that is completely fine. For this presentation, however, when I say API specification, I'm referring to the specific documented syntactical requirements an API designer writes to. Examples of API specifications include OpenAPI and AsyncAPI. When I talk about API definition, I'm referring to JSON or YAML, those documents that capture your unique API's business intent written to a specification requirement. Again, when I talk about an API specification, I'm talking about what a standards body writes. When I talk about an API definition, I'm talking about what you write. There's also a fair number of links that I'm going to either talk directly about or refer to during the course of this conversation. If you can't wait for this presentation to be published somewhere, go to my Twitter. In the footer on every one of the slides, there's a Twitter handle there. If you go to that Twitter profile, the pinned tweet happens to have all the links for this presentation already shared, and you can go ahead and ignore me that way. So hopefully save that for after we're done. Let's start, though, by rewinding the clock. Guido of Arezzo was a Benedictine monk living in Italy at the turn of the millennium before last, or around 1000 AD. Guido had a standardization notation problem. At the time, the pinnacle of popular music was liturgical chants. People went crazy for them. But as Guido visited churches, he noticed how much younger singers struggled to learn the songs. It was common to have a parchment with the words and some occasional squiggles that suggested a performer should move their pitch higher or lower. However, there was no representation of pitch. Where do you start? The solution, Guido reasoned, was to invent a means that would allow someone to sing along even if they had never heard the music before. So, Guido invented the staff. With fixed notes and a specification for how to convey them, Young students could, quote, better detect the level of pitch, as Guido. People new to APIs also have trouble getting started. And API documentation is usually the first thing we think about when we think about what to do with an API description. Unfortunately, that's often where our creativity ends too. The image on this slide is a grossly oversimplified development process, but one that is all too common. In it, a bunch of work is done to create a thing, and when it's ready to go live, some documentation is made for the customer. Don't get me wrong, documentation made this way is better than a random PDF or a CMS entry. Both of those are akin to the non uniform random squiggles Guido students previously had. There's a ton of places where you can insert an open API description and get out some beautifully rendered documentation, either for your own dev portal or for sharing directly with a customer. However, documenting at the end means that any context and nuance of why something is the way it is has been has to be recreated and reassembled. Things get left out. The API description, when treated this way, becomes lipstick on a pig. A standardized representation of intent, or an API description, can be used for more than documentation. If we start treating our API description as our central source of truth about the API, rather than an afterthought or a nice to have, as it is in the case of documentation, a whole host of options open up. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to detail 4 areas, and then we're going to do some extrapolation and some future projection. The 4 areas I'm going to cover are code generation, testing, monitoring, and governance. We're going to get creative. There's no shortage of client code generators. The OpenAPI generator supports an incredible number of programming languages. I had to make the type super tiny on this slide just to try and fit them all in. Now, when you try and generate a client or a server stub using something like this, it won't write everything. You still have to come in and write some bits to make it work. However, being able to get through the tedious, non-differentiated boilerplate is a huge time saver. And it's not just client code. If you have an open API description of how an API works, you can also stub out a server implementation. In this slide, I have a picture of the Postman interface. I've loaded an open API 3.0 description, and next to the YAML syntax, I have a button, one click, that allows me to create the beginnings of my server code. The servers can be in Go, Node.js, Java, Python. It's an incredibly powerful way to kickstart new development and the next logical step in what we do with these open API descriptions. It's also possible to generate SDKs. SDKs, for those of you that have been in this space for a while, you know that they kind of have a tricky problem. They cut both ways. They're great for getting clients up and running quickly, but when you have regular repeated changes, trying to keep feature parity across all those different code bases can be incredibly difficult. Plaid has an incredible case study that shows how they use an open API description to auto-generate their SDKs, thus keeping all of their code bases in sync and feature parity throughout their development lifecycle. But it's not just code that we can generate. Let's take it to the next level and talk about generating test code for our code that we just created. Testing an API is one of the most important things we can do. However, not all testing is created equal. At the bottom of this pyramid of testing needs, we have making sure that our response payload is good, making sure that when we make the request that we get the response that we intend in the shape that we intended. That's very important. Next up, we have chaining API calls. Once we know that one request works the way we assume it would be, now we start putting together more complex workflows, situations where we know there's going to be multiple calls in a row in order to achieve a certain workflow or a certain task to be done. Next level up, we have data-driven requests. This is where we take our static requests and response and we start changing the data, changing the information that we're putting in, starting to press the edges of what we are sending and what the response is coming back. Above that, we have negative tests or error flows, or as we commonly call it, getting off the happy path. Can we break this? What happens when we do break it? Do we fail gracefully? And finally, at the top of the pyramid, we have contract testing, where it's now no longer just about my API and making sure that my API is good, but now I'm starting to go out and I'm starting to look at the other APIs that I'm dependent on, and I'm pressing them and I'm prodding them and I'm making sure that their performance is up to snuff and expectation. Like many pyramids, every level is sized in approximate proportion to how much effort should be expended. So, for example, companies should spend a large amount of effort verifying that the response payloads are structured correctly. However, that just so happens to be the most tedious testing code to write. Therefore, it's a no-brainer that we leverage an open API description. We leverage something like a standardized format to help us generate these tedious test cases so that we can free ourselves for more higher level, more value driven type of operations. If you have a valid open API document already inside Postman, it can be used to create test cases to be run across multiple endpoints. Or if you dig in a little bit deeper, you can customize those tests on a per endpoint basis. Like code generation, generating the tests in this way frees the brain cycles to focus on other things. The generation is possible because we have a standardized notation, possible of conveying our intent, even if we haven't seen the API before. Things get really interesting when we take that set of generated code and the set of generated tests and we connect it to automation. We are now able to aggregate and monitor a complex system. We are able to see not just individual APIs for the trees that they are. Instead, monitoring whole collections of APIs gives us a sense for the larger forest. Recently, Postman's founder, Abhinav, shared a vision of the API platform landscape. And there are many companies in that view that perform what we call API monitoring. That is, using a remote computer to send requests to an API on a scheduled basis. But just ensuring that an API is running or not is the same thing we were doing a decade ago. It is important. Servers got to be up, but it also just scratches the surface of the complex automation possible with API descriptions and simple bridging code. Many are familiar with the website If This Then That. With API descriptions, creating workflows via the Postman monitor is nearly as easy. As I mentioned, the purpose of the Postman Open Technology Program is to elevate API practice across all industries. As you might imagine, that entails lots. Rather than just using a monitor to tell me whether the services I care about are up or down, I created a workflow to prompt me to get my writing done. I used an open API description to create a call to a cloud-based markdown editor that I use. That gets me the words that I've written so far on a daily basis. I then put together some logic, not to worry about weekends, because the worst thing to do on a weekend is get a stress-inducing notification. Finally, I merged that whole process with another open API description for a service that gives me US holidays. Again, so I don't get alarms and notifications for when I should be relaxing and recuperating. Altogether, I put together not just something that tells me if the API is good or bad on a regular basis, but I'm creating new services, new solutions in a very low code or no code way. That's extremely powerful. And I probably wouldn't have programmed all that. But using descriptions, which can subsequently feed into a process, I can build chains of these things. That's incredibly powerful for the people in your organizations who may not be full-blown developers, but still want to take advantage of information and data that's available. That brings us to governance. An API journey doesn't start with a cast of thousands. For most companies, their first API began as a targeted means to some specific business end. Scaling architectures, processes, training, and tooling was far from the minds of all involved on the onset, as it should be. A town shouldn't build its public works department when there's only a few homesteads in a new frontier. With more people creating APIs, however, more experience styles and bespoke infrastructure is introduced into the growing ecosystem. In the absence of repeatable processes, preferred techniques, and uniform tooling, the results from API production become unpredictable. The coordination costs across unaligned pockets of practice increase with inefficiency. Higher order alignment suffers. As described in the book Accelerate, teams become adrift, concentrated on micro optimizations, disconnected from aligned business delivery. Somebody needs to be concerned with those higher order concerns. What businesses often do when in this position, however, is put down some kind of heavy-handed gatekeeping type of governance. And that's unfortunate because using standards, using API descriptions, we can actually put in some very lightweight, meaningful ways of aligning our practice that don't require tedious manual reviews. I've blogged about this. And again, if you want the links for this presentation, go to the Twitter. There's no footer on this slide, but they're the same footer for the rest of the slides. Go to the Twitter, get the links. My previous blog post is in there. But to create a consistency in approaches, many companies create API style guides. And they just assume that if they've written it down once, whatever they write will be interpreted correctly and the same by all people. And unfortunately, based on my own experience, that's simply not the case. In the slide, I have an example piece of guidance that might appear in an API style guide. It's a piece of guidance around pagination. And if you read through that, it's fairly straightforward. It just basically says, if you're going to paginate over a collection, use limit and offset. If I'm writing this and I'm putting it in the style guide, I might think that's simple. Everybody should understand that. However, what happens in practice is you get something like what's on the left-hand side, that interpretation, where yes, somebody created an OpenAPI description and they're going to paginate, so they include limit and offset, but it's very anemic. It's a API description of lowest common denominator. It meets the letter of the style guide, but it doesn't meet the spirit. If I'm consuming this, I have to intuit quite a bit about what limit and offset mean. The right-hand side is very verbose, and therefore there's much more there that caused the font to shrink down. However, the bottom line is that this version of the API style guide leaves nothing to chance. It describes everything in full detail, something that I can make programmatic decisions about without having to have a meeting, without having to call people together and have that communication overhead. It's actually meeting the spirit of the style guide, which is let's be consistent for the sake of saving us time. But I shouldn't expect a brand new developer at my company to figure all that out. I should have this example in my style guide so that when that API designer needs to do pagination, they copy, they paste, they customize, they're done. And voila, suddenly by making alignment the easiest way to write my API description by copy pasting, we can now move forward and get greater consistency across all the things that we're creating. It sounds simple, but it's an extremely powerful way of that alignment. Just give them some example style guide they can copy paste. And of course, there's also things like validation. There's so much that can be done. OpenAPI tools, the picture on the left, does a fantastic job of categorizing a large number of them. Likewise, the OpenAPI converter, pictured on the right-hand side, can also take an API description in a variety of formats. Both can be used to ensure that an API description adheres to expectations and thus avoids fragmentation. Similarly, there's also a number of tools that are able to take an API description and nudge practice to a healthier place. not having a tedious manual review where suddenly it's a contest of wills for who is right, but using the tooling in the moment that somebody needs help to nudge them and say, hey, there's something you could be doing better here. Security is a pressing issue at the moment. As I'm showing here in the slide, the tool is warning the API author that not only are they not providing any kind of authorization for their endpoints, but the entirety of communication is happening over unsecured HTTP. We'll continue to see tools get more opinionated and thus support API designers with insights at the moment where it is most beneficial while they're in the midst of designing. That was a quick run through of 4 areas: cogen, testing, monitoring, and governance that can benefit anyone today that's looking to see what they can get out of a description centric approach. But let's go even further. Let's back out and ask what happens when entire industries are singing from the same songbook. I love the story that Gene, hey Gene, um, founder and CEO of Akita Software, shared recently while talking with Eric. There's a YouTube video there. The goal of Akita Software was to help developers make sense of their complex distributed systems. They began to approach the problem in a systems way and briefly considered integration with OpenTelemetry or maybe integrate with a service mesh like Envoy. The problem is that those are not standardized systems. Not everybody uses a service mesh, and when they do, it's not always Envoy. So as a result, Akita started looking at code and data and then realized that APIs provided that standardized point that was uniformly consistent across all providers and architectures and languages. Because services had adopted this common lingua franca, they were able to build a new set of observations and insights and grow a business. Likewise, a company called Steady, and apparently the image isn't loading. That's cool. But a company is doing some amazing things around electronic data exchange or EDI. Now, EDI has been around since the 1970s. It attempts to standardize the exchange of business information like purchase orders and invoices. What Steady has done is apply modern approaches to schema validation, like use JSON schema. And in doing so, suddenly there's a whole host of modern tooling that can now be applied to these older, more staid and stagnant data formats. It's unlocking an incredible amount of value. But in conclusion, let's go back to this guy. Let's talk about Guido again. In the centuries since Guido invented standardized musical notation, there were many additions. First, they included duration, then bar lines, then stylized clefs, dynamic markings, ties, and slurs. This was to support a growing number of instruments and vocal styles. Music grew beyond liturgical chants. In the Renaissance era, music tended to remain at a single tempo for the duration of the piece. But that gave way to the Baroque era, one marked by increased composition creativity. Baroque also established the opera, the concerto, and the sonata as musical genres. This creativity didn't happen in isolation. The development of a standardized notation, a specification, allowed composers to cross-pollinate, enrich, and continue to evolve each other's work. But unless you're a music nerd, that may be just trivia. So let's make this less abstract. To help students remember his new standard, Guido also invented something else you might be familiar with, a mnemonic that helps people remember the steps between tones on his staff. You probably know it. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That mnemonic is featured prominently in the 1965 film Sound of Music. That film and the Von Trapp family within was seen by millions, including my wife and I. I don't have a Gretel, but I have a Greta. I also have a Liesel. Guido, in 1000 AD, wouldn't have known what a movie was, let alone comprehend his influence on it. Furthermore, he couldn't have conceived how a standard representation would ultimately influence my daughter's names, but it did. Swagger, the predecessor came out in 2010, a little more than a decade ago. It's not even a teenager yet. What kind of things are we going to see emerge from having a standard, a way of communicating in a common format? That's to come. And I can't wait. Thank you so much for your time. If you want to get a hold of me, I've got some links right there on the slide. You can either go to my website, you can go to my email newsletter, or you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm happy to chat about this stuff and more anytime. But let's go ahead, and we have a little bit of time if we want to do some Q&A. Go ahead, and if you would, just go ahead and use the Q&A section of the chat, and we'll see if we get anything. All right, Kevin Swiber's cat is Chupacabra. Sweet. All right, here's a Q&A question from Jean. She asks, Matthew, I'm super curious what you think we should be doing more with the open API specs in the next 3 to 5 years. I think obviously internal operations are going to continue to drive a lot of the growth over the next 3 to 5 years. I think so much of what we talk about when we talk about the API economy is externally facing, but as more and more and more of the processes and routines inside companies become API'd, we're going to see more and more and more opportunities for facilitating that kind of growth and management. As far as going beyond the next few years, the next 3 to 5 years, I think there's a tremendous opportunity. As I alluded to, Akita is a fascinating example of seeing a locus of standardization and saying, oh my gosh, this is where we can play because this is where we can uh, take advantage of the standardization. And I think we're still figuring out those opportunities. So as the internals for companies continue to be API'd, and then we have these systems for governing and monitoring those, we're also going to see whole new abstractions in companies building on top of the fact that that's how internal operations happens. All right. Next question, David. Thoughts on security audits based on static analysis of OpenAPI description, dynamic standing. Hey, if it's automated, why not? Granted, there's a limit to what can be picked up through static type of scanning, but it's better than nothing. And because it's not consuming any more man hours than what it takes to get it set up, it should be done on a regular basis. It's not perfect. There will always be abilities to get around things, but again, compared to where we are right now as an industry, where you still see some jaw-droppingly bad practice, it's the first step toward getting healthier practice. All right. Next question. Kevin says, should the responsibility of governance be centralized by committee or distributed via various roles and teams? That is a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have my architect hat. Otherwise, I would put it on and I'd say, it depends. It's extremely driven by the type of organizational culture that you are in. So, for example, if you are already in a highly regulated type of environment, insurance, healthcare, finance, those type of things, chances are you already have a culture that's built around gatekeeping and audits and that ongoing practice of demonstrating efficacy. In those particular cases, you don't want to come in from left field and suddenly introduce something that nobody knows what it is or how it functions. You have to take the context of the organization into account. Uh, on the flip side, if you have a growing startup where everything has been ad hoc and developers have had a tremendous amount of autonomy and decision making, plopping a center of excellence or a rigid centralized organization whose responsibility is to track these things, that's going to create a huge amount of disruption. So, in those particular cases, leading with coach led governance or community practice led governance is probably the better approach. But again, it depends a lot on the organization and the features at play.